Hi, this is Kerwin Gaines, and welcome to The Agenda. This week, we have Representative Rich Collins talking to us about the EV mandate here in the state of Delaware, and the difference between legislation, the difference between regulation. We're going to have a great conversation. Welcome to the show, Representative Collins.
I am good, and I'm happy to be here.
Tonight, we're going to talk about Delaware's legislation and regulation, as you bring up to me, about EV vehicles. And you're not happy about that.
No, I have a lot of concerns, and for those who aren't familiar, we're talking about a requirement the state is debating to force people from Delaware to adopt a regulation that actually is created by the state of California. Mm-hmm. And it's about basically by 2035, and it happens gradually, but by 2035, the sale of gas and diesel cars and trucks up to 14,000 pounds will be banned, and a person will have to buy either an electric vehicle or possibly something like hydrogen, which really isn't available yet, but that's a possibility.
So, I mean, I see everything from Teslas to Fords now, and their line with the electric Mustangs, and some of these cars are becoming very, very popular. But to me, it seems like it's something that can't be stopped. But I also see it as a good thing, right? As far as emissions go, as far as our overall environment, which I do believe is changing, how rapidly is up to a lot of different people. But I believe that DENREC is coming from a place of, hey, the rest of the country is moving in this direction. The rest of the world is moving in this direction. Why would Delaware be behind, right? So why can't we ensure our environment for our next generation?
All right, well, two things. First of all, I would say the world is definitely not moving this direction. Now, where they are is certain states in the United States and Europe, Western Europe. They definitely are. But about 12 to 14 states in the US and then most of Western Europe. But my main objection is simply that they're doing it out without the people's representatives having a voice. Mm-hmm. They're doing it through regulation, which means the folks that the people in this audience vote for, whether they be senators or representatives, have no say. As a matter of fact, well, very, very late in the process, most of us didn't even know it was going on. Mm-hmm. And we think that's wrong. The Constitution says that we are the people's voice. And so the people, when they ignore the General Assembly, they're leaving the people out of the process. And that is not the way our country's supposed to work.
I understand. So you made it very clear to me off air about the difference between legislation and regulation. And there are two parts to this. Could you explain that a little bit more?
Yes, because in addition to this regulation that would ban gas and diesel vehicles over time, there's another bill out there called House Bill 99. And what that does is would have the state create open-ended regulations. As far as I'm concerned, kind of a regulatory storm where every agency would be ordered to think up whatever things they could to regulate things in the atmosphere. Mm-hmm. So this is legislation, and we will vote on that. If I'm hoping that we will vote against it because what it does, our vote only starts the process. Once we vote on the bill, then we're out of the picture. For the next 20, 30, 40 years, regulators, meaning the nameless, faceless folks who work in these offices, will be deciding what it is they're going to regulate and how they're going to regulate it. And again, legislators will have no say going forward. Mm-hmm. So that means the people will have no say.
So the regulation in regards to this is just as powerful as a law, if not more so?
I would say in most cases when a person really interacts with the government in a strong way, like the government says you can or cannot do something, probably 90% of the time it's a regulation and not a law. Mm-hmm. Now some of the exceptions, like if you're doing the laws about you rob a gas station, you go to jail for X. Those are done by law. But just about anything else, like you want permission to build a building, you need a building permit, you need a hunting license. Practically anything you can think of, you're dealing with regulation, and they actually have far more potential to impact the average person than laws do.
So talk to me about House Bill 99, which is the legislation.
House Bill 99 does things that I just don't think we know how to do.
Okay.
It says by 2030, which is only 7 years from now, less than 7 years from now, somehow we're going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50%. And then somehow by 2050, which again is only 27 years from now, which is not particularly long. If you're as old as I am, it's real short. We're going to reduce it to zero. They're not bothering to tell us how that would happen. I personally have never heard any explanation of how that could even be technically feasible. But that's the problem with regulation. They can demand that you do it without telling you how you're going to do it. So I don't know. It just I think it's totally impractical. But what I think it will do is have severe impacts on people's trying to get a job, people trying to buy a vehicle, people who want to travel, people who want to have upward mobility in life, young people that want to start out without a lot. Like frankly, when I started out early in life, I had very little. My family was certainly not wealthy, but I did have the idea that if I worked hard, that over the years I could achieve and get to a higher place. I really think a lot of people, if this bill passes, I think it will be a huge impediment to many, many people having that upward mobility going forward.
So what worries me is I still feel like I love gas cars. I love Corvettes. I love the way they sound and move, and I know that that may be going away if we go to electric, although Corvette does have an electric model now. But is this just the way that it's going? Like what's the real, and you made it clear that it's affecting the economy, and it will affect local economies, it will affect car dealerships, it will affect the cost of purchasing a new vehicle, which I understand. But with most new technologies, they spike in the beginning and kind of go down as we move forward because they still want to sell cars. But what is the downside of this? I mean, what is the true downside?
Well, just about everything that has really taken over the world, let's say television at one time. Back in the day where there's black and white TV only, and then we had color, and eventually, and first color TVs, almost nobody could afford them. And then one day everybody had now a color TV is very, very inexpensive. Same thing with gas cars. I mean, when they first came along, only the very wealthy had one, and then more people had them, and today most people have one. And the computers, you know, again, all this stuff starts out as very high-end, very, very expensive, very exclusive, and then as the technology matures, it becomes more desirable and more people have it. Look at cell phones. Now people on the street, everybody has a cell phone, no matter what your economic status. Now, was that because government demanded that we all have cell phones? No. Did the government back in Henry Ford's day demand that people be provided with less expensive cars? No. It was done by supply and demand. The people wanted it, and therefore manufacturers created it. But today, with this electric car thing, the technology is not there.
But I see so many of them on the road. They're doing things. They're turning into. We're building tractor trailers that'll now, you know, be electric and be able to carry long distances. Lawnmowers, all the way down to you know, regular vehicles on the road are already battery powered. So talk to me about the technology not being there.
It's just very simple, battery capacity. I drove to Florida this past January. I used a gas pickup. I put gas in it twice. 1,200-mile trip. If I had been driving a high-end Tesla, which are A lot of them are over 100,000. I certainly could have driven there in a Tesla, let's make that clear. That's a wonderful car. But I would have had to stop and charge probably 3 to 4 times. And remember, we're talking about a 16-hour trip. So now you're adding a couple hours for charging at least. Now, if I'd bought a car that was more affordable, one that the average person might consider if they're not wealthy, that would be like a Chevy Bolt. Their range is only about 230 miles, I believe. Don't hold me right to that number. It's close. In the wintertime, though, it's much less. When you have to turn your heat on, remember, everything is powered by that battery. So that range drops well below 200 miles in the wintertime. And it was in the winter, it was January. And in the dark, when the headlights are on and all these things are drawing power. So I would have had to charge that car at least 5 or 6 times to get down there, maybe more. But if you wanted to tow a trailer, and I'm talking now about people whose job depends on having a trailer, carrying that piece of equipment, or someone who has a camper or a boat, the pickup trucks that are available right now will not even go 100 miles. If I had been trying to tow a boat to Florida, which I have done 3 times in my life, I would have had to stop and recharge at least 12 to 14 times. And each time on those vehicles, because the battery is larger, it's going to take you about 45 minutes. So this is why I say, the cars, if you need a car, in fact, the president of Ford Motor Company said this on somewhere, I saw it just a few days ago. He says, folks, if you're pulling a camper or a heavy boat, a Ford Lightning is not the vehicle for you. He said, though, if you're in town, in a city, where you're making relatively short trips, you're not talking about hours-long trips, then it may be the perfect vehicle for you. So the problem is that mandate. If I lived in Wilmington and had a car in town here, I might very well consider an electric car. But I live in rural Sussex County, where everything is far apart, and we have to make relatively long trips. And I have done the investigation, and I do not feel today that the technology is appropriate for that. Now, someday, it may very well be. And when it does, when it becomes suitable, people will demand it. They won't just, they'll actually demand it. The government does not have to force it. But the other huge issue that no one's talking about is the fact that we have very, very few charging stations in Delaware.
So yeah, let's talk about the infrastructure side of this. That's a big push. But before we get to that, let's go back to one point in regards to these electric vehicles and whether or not they're capable with boats and so many of these other large things that we have to pull. But they're not all going away, right? So these used vehicles, these used trucks will still be available, just the new vehicles will have to be electric. But up to a certain year, the pre-owned vehicles will still be available. They're not saying, hey, you have to get rid of your gas-powered car. They're not saying, oh, you have to, drop them off at some gas station somewhere. They're saying, hey, look, you can still drive those, but manufacturers will not be producing these cars after a certain time.
Well, yes and no. The problem with regulation is, again, it's very, very difficult for people to learn about them. This particular regulation has not been discussed about openly by the Department of Natural Resources. The second half of the California regulation that we are adopting as a Delaware regulation says we are going to do everything we can to get the older cars off the road as soon as we can. So while yes, in 2035, now remember, it's this amount is going up every year by 6 or 7%. So it's easy to say, well, that's so far away. But in 2 years, folks, when you go to the dealer, if this regulation goes into place, 35% of your choices are going to be electric. And the companies, the car companies, have already told dealers, if this happens in Delaware, we're not sending you the gas cars. You may very well find a lot more of them are electric than just 35%. That number goes up by 6 or 7% every single year. So in 2034, 93% of your choices, give or take, are going to only be electric. But the other big problem is, in 2035, if you want to buy, so let's say you're a younger person, you're getting started in life, so you want to buy I don't know, I want to be careful with these years because, again, it seems to be so far away, and I can just tell you, life moves faster as you get older. So at some point, the newest car you'll be able to buy that's gasoline will be 10 years old. How many people go into a dealer and say, show me your 10-year-old cars? Some do, because that's all they can afford. But for the most part, that's not what the average person wants. And then each and every year, those cars get older. But I also believe this, because of what I said about the problems with batteries, I think it's only natural. Then there's also a lot of skepticism about the electric car. Polls have shown that about, depending on what poll you look at, 30 to 50% of people say they will not consider an electric car right now. So what that means is there's probably going to be a very increased demand for those used gas cars that will drive their price up as well. And I mean, we saw that effect during the pandemic. When vehicles got more scarce, the price, good grief, the dealers were adding $10,000, $20,000 to the cost of a car in many cases, because there just weren't enough of them.
So let's talk about the infrastructure side. How is this going to affect infrastructure? What are your concerns?
Well, let's talk about the number one obvious problem.
Infrastructure's in the state of Delaware. Let's
in
just
the state of
there.
Delaware. I'm sitting in Wilmington right now. Many people in urban areas live in townhouses, apartments, maybe row houses, condos, where you have a lot of buildings tight together. So one friend of mine says, look, I live in a 250 unit, I believe it's a condo. He says, we would have to have 500 chargers just for our complex.
Right.
And then he said, and what about my son? He's almost 16. We want to get him a car. He's going to need a charger too. So I have had numerous discussions with the electric companies. Do you have the ability to allow that many people to have chargers? Well, the 500 is just a giant laugh. Absolutely not. But even on many of your streets, you would have no idea. The transformer on those streets were never designed for that kind of load. Once you get, what I've been told by electric companies, people, is that once you start adding X number of chargers, the transformers on that street may very well run out of capacity, which means then they'd have to put an entirely different transformer and probably larger wires as well. But the other big problem is that right now, Delaware just doesn't have any chargers. I shouldn't say none, but it's very few.
They have some compared to other states, and I've seen some of the comments about how Delaware ranks low in regards to EV vehicles compared to other states. But I think that comes down to per capita, right? We have just 1 million people maybe within the state.
I can tell you that numerous people called me over the last 2 or 3 months when this thing got hot and heavy, when the debate got hot and heavy.
We'll talk about the debate in a second, but go ahead.
They just said the electric cars that they bought were not satisfactory. One woman told me that she lives in Milford, Delaware, has to go to the University of Delaware fairly regularly.
Right.
And when she goes home at night, she has had to stop in Dover and charge up at a pizza place, because it was the only charger she could find sitting there in the parking lot in the dark. The system is not there. Furthermore, I do not see any signs that the state is moving at any pace whatsoever that would create all these chargers in the short time that we will need them.
So is that something legislatively, I mean, I'm asking you, is that something legislatively that we can do to push this? We got, I think, an ample amount of infrastructure dollars. Of course, there's never enough. But is this the time to really begin to build that? Do we need to put legislative bills together to ensure that we're beefing up our grid?
Well, keep in mind, our grid is composed of about 65 million people. So it's not just Delaware. Here's what our grid told us just a few days ago. This is PJM, that's the name of it. Because of pressure on them to close down fossil fuel power plants, they're anticipating a reduction in capacity of 21% in the next 10 years. At the same time, they expect a demand growth of 1.4% a year. Now, this is without, remember, none of these electric car mandates in the Northeast, many of them in our grid, many of these states are considering imposing this on their people. None of them have, none of these things have started yet. So they don't know how many of them are actually going to do it. If they actually go electric, that means the demand will even be much higher than they just said. They're trying to tell us in a kind of a diplomatic way, we don't have enough electricity for all this. Trying to switch over everything to electricity. Right now, electricity only creates about 20% of our energy, total energy.
Okay.
They want to increase that number to possibly as high as 35 or 40% in a very, very short time frame. Because improving the grid, remember, is not just building more power plants, it's also improving all the lines, which is a massive cost, but also the other major thing is permitting. One of the things that we're finding out, and this is going on in California right now, the governor has realized they are shutting down their fossil fuel plants, and they thought they were going to replace them with wind and solar. But they are developing massive objections from their population, and their projects are not getting approved. PJM said that here in this area, that only 5% of the green energy, wind and solar, they thought they were going to get have been permitted so far. And again, it's because mostly objections from the population and then the cost. It's very, very expensive running these lines across miles and miles and miles. You know, electricity, the longer the wire is, the weaker the electricity is. So you have to have ways to boost that electricity as you go across the miles. That's all that tremendous amount of engineering and money and a lot of intrusion on people.
So let's get to the way this regulation is being passed. Secretary Garwin, correct me if I'm wrong? Garvin, excuse me. He proposed this regulation for the EV vehicles, and it went to a public hearing process, correct? And you hosted one of these public hearings.
I did. Well, it started by the governor. The governor requested that Secretary Garvin to do this back in March of last year. Last year, March of 22. And but in his announcement, which you can go to the governor's website and still read, it doesn't say anything about banning gas or diesel cars. He just said we're going to reduce the numbers. So then it kind of went dark for a long time. And then I was told by someone that meetings were going on that I didn't know about, and I don't think any other legislator knew about them. Okay. That was in October of 22. And so he told me about it, and I went and joined one of those, and I actually publicized it myself. And we increased the attendance from about 40 to 250. These were Zoom meetings.
Okay.
Well, at that point, DENREC did actually send out one email to legislators that I know of, telling us they were working on this. And they had a few more meetings late in 2022. And at this point, some of the public knew, and they started getting involved, and a lot more people, hundreds started showing up now. But the way the public
have an obligation to let the House know?
Absolutely. Actually, by law, no. That's another huge problem with the regulation. When the laws were written 50 years ago, in my opinion, legislators of that time did never really realize that these regulations could be used in this way.
Okay.
I can tell you that back 50 years ago, this would not have happened. But now it's kind of normal to kind of try and hide things you don't want legislators to find out.
Okay.
So anyway, so now they published the regulation. That's a legal act. So up till that point, this is as of April 1st, the regulation was published. That's in the Register of Regulations. Up to that point, it was just a discussion. Although obviously the employees of DENREC were having meetings all the time. Now, April 1st, it's published. That opens up the public comment period. At that point, those who knew could start telling the world how they felt, telling DENREC how they felt. And DENREC had, but their legal obligation was to have one public hearing, which they did on April 26th, I believe, of this year. In my opinion, they did their best to keep people from being able to speak. The reason I say that, I've been involved in this kind of process for years and years. In the past, you walked into the hearing room, you told the person in the back, I want to testify, they wrote your name down, that was it. And then they called you in order. Mm-hmm. On this one, you were told you had to register by internet by noon the day of the hearing. Well, a lot of people, believe it or not, still don't have computers or internet. And then when you went to register, there were several buttons, and in my opinion, it was confusing. The first button, if you registered that way, didn't allow you to speak. And then I personally registered the day before. I registered 24 hours ahead of time. When I got up there to speak, I was told, well, you didn't register, you're not on our list. Well, what am I going to say? And they didn't let me testify. So after a while, I said, this is not right. We need to make sure people have the opportunity. And they did have a comment period that lasted till May 26th. That was last Friday. So I said, we're going to hold a public hearing. We're going to invite people to come, whether you're for it or against it. I represent everyone, right? So you're more than welcome. Anybody's welcome to support this if you want to. Mm-hmm. So I said, I got on the radio. I said, come to a public hearing, and we're going to give you a form to make sure it was legal. Mm-hmm. But you're going to write what you want on that form. And we did, and we turned those in last week. We had about 600, I think, between that meeting, which was 500, and then a couple small meetings. But I contacted DENREC today about how come they're not posted on their website yet, because you're supposed to be able to go and look at their website and see all these. And They were there a few weeks ago, what had been turned in. But they told us that they have thousands of comments that they're working on, that they're putting into the system. So I'm assuming that soon we'll be able to go in and look at all these comments.
Well, hopefully we'll have a fruitful discussion of both sides of it, and we'll see how this regulation goes, how it affects the economy. We're going to be watching it here on the agenda. Feel free to come back and talk to us again about it. Report back to us about how things are going. If there's any hiccups or anything like this, we appreciate it. Gas was $3.57 on a national average this week, so I don't know.
Well, that was something else that really bothered me about the whole DENREC discussion. They put out a price that it would cost to run an electric car without any acknowledgement that all energy prices change all the time.
That's true.
And I can promise you, if you try to increase electricity demand by close to double in a short period of time, you're going to see the price of electricity go through the roof. The other thing they never mentioned was the fact that these batteries have to be replaced every once in a while, and that they're going to cost from $15,000 to $25,000 depending on the car. And I can tell you, if you've got a 10-year-old battery-powered car and it's got 150, 200,000 miles on it, you go in to try and trade it in, and the dealer knows you're going to have to put a $20,000 battery in it, I can tell you that car is not going to have much trade-in value. That's the other big negative that DENREC never once acknowledged.
Thank you very much for watching the agenda this week. We'd like to thank Representative Rich Collins for keeping an eye on this EV issue. We look forward to him checking back in. I have a feeling that he will, to talk about DENREC and all the things that are going on in the state and our mandates for a cleaner environment. We look forward to seeing you next week right here on the agenda.